Our story begins in the middle of a rainy scene, where a guy is seemingly fighting something, when out of nowhere, a lightning bolt strikes. It's there to dry things up. Relax, everyone. The story has started off strange, but calm down. It's all just a dream, and waking up from this dream is our protagonist. Or, if you prefer, Yudan Diok. I think I'll just call him Yu or Prota, because his full name is a bit of a tongue twister. Anyway, Yu wakes up feeling pretty confused since he was in the middle of a job interview. And the questions were kind of weird, like they asked him how he would purify water. Prota answered that he'd use a special purification machine, but they cut him off halfway, saying they got it and moved on to the next question. Then came the dreaded question that every interviewer asks: why do you want to join our company? As soon as Prota began to answer, he was cut off again. The interviewers started pointing out that, after looking at his resume, it seemed Prota had no talent. It was honestly more embarrassing than anything else. The poor guy just woke up from a dream, and bam, he's getting slapped around for free, you know? And the interviewer didn't stop there, continuing with, if you don't have any talent, why are you even trying to apply for such a big corporation as ours? Prota fired back with his own question, asking why they even put up a job listing. The interviewer went on about how they only posted it because of anti-discrimination laws for people without talent. But reality was quite different. We're already diving into some workplace bullying here, folks, and this looks like it's going to get ugly. So why is Prota dealing with this kind of harassment? Well, after dungeons were discovered, a lot of people awakened hidden abilities, which they started calling talents. Because of this, society rapidly advanced. Some even considered awakening talents a blessing for humanity. Prota believed that too, until he discovered that he didn't have any talent. Naturally, a lot of companies started adapting to this new talent economy, and people like Prota without talent were left out. That's why they questioned whether Prota had any sense at all. And now, my friends, Prota was furious. He said, "You realize you're saying something discriminatory against someone without talent, right?" The interviewer started trembling and asked what Prota was talking about, claiming he hadn't said anything wrong. They were just tired of people like him. He then questioned whether Prota was getting full of himself because he seemed very rude. Prota responded, "What do you mean? I'm just asking for fair treatment. How is that rude? So, in that case, you should apologize to me." The interviewer was taken aback, saying, "What do you mean? Shouldn't it be the other way around? After all, you wasted our time, so you should apologize." But hold up, folks. Prota wasn't backing down. He asked them straight up if they were really not going to apologize. And since they were holding that stance, he wanted to see if they'd keep those lines in front of a court. After all, the whole conversation was recorded. Long story short, the interviewer was screwed. They lied about their job listing being a non-discriminatory one and now expected Prota to apologize. They were done for, folks. The interviewer realized he was in deep trouble and scrambled, but it was too late. Prota left, and they knew all the nasty things they'd said would end up with the Human Rights Committee. Prota stormed out of there, angry. Just because he didn't have a talent didn't mean he couldn't stand up for himself, right? Oh, and of course, he reported all of this to the Human Rights Committee too. As Prota left, he was questioning whether this whole talent business was really good for humanity. And so began his daily life as a self-proclaimed loser. While he was grumbling about it all, he stepped in gum. And as he was trying to scrape it off his shoe, a car splashed him with water. Man, this guy just can't catch a break. It's like he's cursed or something. Enemy of luck, enemy of service, and best friends with laziness or something. What a day. On his way home, things got even worse when some street dogs decided to pee on his window. His room was a mess, but he couldn't really wallow in self-pity. After cleaning up a bit, he called his mom, who seemed to be in the hospital. She was worried about him, saying he was going through all this bad stuff because of her. And, to top it off, if it wasn't for his uncle who'd taken the money they had lent him, but Prota cut her off, telling her not to bring it up. They shouldn't even expect that money back. If his uncle was the type to pay off his debts, he would have done it already. He probably even skipped town. But since Prota was talking to his mom, he apologized for shouting and reassured her that he was doing just fine, thriving in society. He told her not to worry about the hospital bills, that he'd handle everything, and she should focus on herself. After that conversation, Prota left the house, exhausted, ready to enjoy his one daily pleasure. But, of course, even that was taken away from him because it started raining. Man, this guy just can't catch a break. It's like bad luck is his constant companion. He started complaining about life again, saying, "Damn, I can't even enjoy this. My life is already hard enough." And, just so you know, he's yelling all this at God, cursing him out in every possible way. He declared that his life was already a living hell, and he didn't want to live like this anymore. It wasn't his fault, so someone had to be responsible. And as I said earlier, this rage was all directed at God. Did everything that happens next stem from that? We'll have to see. And the guy was absolutely furious. But his bad luck didn't stop there. After being struck by by lightning, he had pretty much given up on life, figuring this was how he was going to die. Apparently, the powers above had read his resume, and now it was time for him to start his new job. Oh, Bezos, so this is how it works. You curse your employer and boom, you get hired? Is that really how it goes? I guess so. At least that's what it seemed like. So after Prota got hit by the lightning, he headed home. He wasn't going to die from the strike, but he was convinced he'd catch a cold and die from that instead. And instead of questioning whether he was alive or how he survived, the only thing on his mind was, God, what am I supposed to do now? Can you believe that? Well, it makes sense. After all, he did just get struck by lightning after cursing out God. Prota was genuinely confused because he never had strong feelings about God, neither good nor bad. So, could this be considered divine punishment? It's odd, right? Usually, when you get struck by lightning, you either die or end up in a critical condition, right? But in Prota's case, there were no injuries at all. Well, there was one change. A strange floating window appeared in front of him. And naturally, the first thing Prota thought was, what's up with this weird window? That's when the window showed up. It didn't display any stats, just a message. Hiring alert. This already disappointed Prota. He was worried, like, seriously? Now even the gods want to hire me for part-time work. And maybe as a response, the window started glowing, growing larger, kind of like that Iron Man holographic interface. You know, with all the moving pieces? Yeah, it was something like that. However, Prota was confused because he was already working part-time jobs. And now his only hope was to wake up. But would he still be stuck doing part-time work even then? Man, even his luck was awful. But in the end, he thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. And since the opportunity was literally staring him in the face, he decided to accept it. Then he started looking at the available jobs. Everything was well organized, divided between Eastern and Western regions. And since he had nothing better to do, he decided to give it a shot. But just as he was about to accept the job, the system notified him that he didn't have a deity. In this job system, deity refers to strength, which is something gods use. So it's probably tied to mana, knowledge, or honor. Something along those lines, stuff only gods or people connected to gods possess. Considering Prota didn't even have talent, why would he have something like that? Still, he figured that if he chased after this, maybe something good would happen. After all, this might be his chance to change his life. The job market in the divine realm seemed to be structured around part-time gigs across the world. So, after searching, Prota found a job that didn't require a deity. And it sounded pretty interesting. Thor, yes, that Thor, the god of thunder, who might have been the one who zapped Prota with lightning earlier, was recruiting people to help create a dungeon. Prota's job was to assist him in the work, and in return, he'd be paid 12 Thors, which was probably some kind of divine currency. There was also a note that Loki's informants couldn't apply, but back to the dungeon building part, this meant there would be loads of monsters involved, right? That opened Prota's mind. Were all the dungeons that hunters fight through created by the gods? How much were 12 Thors worth? Could they be traded for bread? Or was there some kind of currency exchange rate? There was no way he'd figure this out just by guessing, so he accepted the job. And boom, he was teleported to another location. And where did he land? Right in a tree of all places, of course. Struck by lightning, teleported, and now stuck in a tree. It's like the universe, or maybe the DM of this story, really isn't a fan of Prota. Poor guy didn't understand a thing about what was going on or where he was. The first thought that crossed his mind was whether this was all just a dream. But before he could figure it out, a monster attacked him from behind. However, just before it reached him, someone stopped the monster. What an epic entrance, people, an entrance worthy of a hero. And that giant figure standing there? None other than Thor himself. Thor asked if Prota was the new part-time worker. Prota probably recognized him instantly, given how famous Thor is. But there wasn't much time for introductions, so they talked as they walked. Prota started analyzing the situation. There stood a massive figure with wild hair and a giant hammer hanging from his waist, probably Mjolnir. It was hard to believe, though. You press a button, get teleported, and suddenly you're meeting a god? Thor interrupted Prota's daydreams by asking if he was some kind of god from Asia. Prota was stunned. Thor thought he was a god. Looking around, Prota saw several gods, many whose names he couldn't even recognize. No matter where he looked, it seemed Prota was the only human around. Not wanting to break the illusion, Prota played along, saying that he kind of ended up becoming a god over on that mountain over there. Thor bought the story, saying Prota was probably one of those gods who helps humans. But Thor noticed something strange. Prota seemed a little too immersed in human culture, especially based on his clothing. But Prota, being a smooth talker, said enough to convince Thor in the end. Thor asked Prota if he would be alright, since the work they were about to do was a test for humans. Prota wasn't too thrilled about it, but he agreed. Then, Thor asked Prota if he had ever heard of the Minotaur Labyrinth. For those who don't know, here's a quick summary. According to the history of our world, it was built by an architect named Daedalus. The story is really long, so if you're curious, you can look up the Labyrinth of Crete. I'm sure you'll get the gist of it. Anyway, those familiar with the story would understand the concept of the dungeon they were about to build. And yes, Proto was going to help them with that. But of course, Proto's luck wasn't the best, so instead of striking it rich by selling inside info about the labyrinth, he just ended up getting called over because he was daydreaming again. He wasn't doing much, and since he didn't have any real talent, he just accepted any work that came his way. People were even praising him for his effort, but knowing him, he'd probably end up stuck in some dangerous situation. And he even asked for help just in case that happened. After a while, they finished the job. A red orc, or maybe an ogre, it wasn't clear, suggested they take a wagon to a nearby area, as walking there would be exhausting. As they walked, the ogre asked Proto if all Asian gods were as energetic as him. Proto replied that it probably depended on each one's personality. The ogre had asked because everyone there was praising Proto, making him a bit embarrassed on the outside, but internally, he was pleased. His social skills were working overtime. In reality, he was working hard to build connections with the gods. Networking with gods, that's next level stuff, so of course he was going to seize the opportunity. After some time, they arrived at their destination. But they couldn't bring the big guy who had been pushing the cart because he might trigger the traps. It wasn't just the big guy though. Proto almost stepped on one himself. The ogre showed Proto the traps, pointing out a symbol on the floor and where the others were. Since this was Proto's first job, he was encouraged to use it as a learning experience. The ogre explained that Proto probably knew already, but the lower-ranked gods were offering trials to humans. Since these lower-ranked gods couldn't participate in higher-level activities, they kept busy with dungeon work. It was an endless task, as new dungeons constantly needed to be built. Leaving that aside, they finally reached the hall they were supposed to work in. The place was huge. The dwarves had been working so quickly, maybe 5 minutes tops. They were clearly experienced, but because of the hall's size, filling it with monsters would be a lot of work. At that moment, the ogre explained that this area would be the first test for anyone entering the dungeon. Proto had been carrying a box with an oval-shaped stone inside, but it wasn't just a stone, it was a poisonous spider. They couldn't release the spiders yet because dealing with them before the dungeon was completed would be too much of a hassle. Another box contained a lizard man, and there was a hole in its throat that, naturally, Proto's curious finger wanted to poke. The ogre stopped him, explaining that the lizard man hadn't fully materialized yet, and that hole was a weak spot. So now we know where to hit it, right? But we're not Proto, so we don't really care, right? Well, Proto's the one who might have to fight it, so maybe we should care a little. Moving on, the next area was the goblin ambush field. If everything went according to plan, it meant that when humans reached this point, they'd be nearing the end of the dungeon. The place was dark, damp, and creepy. In the shadows, Proto saw a strange silhouette, which, as expected, turned out to be a goblin. Suddenly jumped at him, but not to attack. The ogre laughed, explaining that they were just getting ready, and there was no need to be scared. However, once the dungeon was finished, those goblins would be a serious challenge. Even though they're goblins, they're much smarter than they look. Proto almost learned that the hard way. Eventually, they reached the end of the labyrinth. And, of course, what does that mean? That's right, the boss room. At that moment, who shows up? Our buddy Thor, declaring that Proto had been doing a great job and was receiving a lot of praise. Since they had reached the end, it meant that the monster distribution was complete, right? The ogre confirmed that yes, only the final part of the process remained. With that, the lower-ranking gods could clock out and go rest. But then, Thor picked up his hammer. Why? Was he getting ready to punch the clock? No, Proto thought Thor was about to hit him instead. And well, he did. Proto was teleported back to his house, trembling, convinced he was going to die. Proto was actually shaking because he thought Thor had figured out that he wasn't really a god but a human. However, the important thing was that everything was real. It wasn't a hallucination or a dream. But now that the work was done, it was time to get paid. Proto was super emotional. It was his first paycheck after all, and so he decided to check out the Lord's store. The things they had there were on an absurd level. The first item was the spear of the all-powerful god Odin, Gungnir, the spear that never misses its target. Another item was the Nemean lion armor, which, for those who don't know, belonged to Hercules. There was also Freya's necklace and other divine items. Naturally, Proto was stunned by these treasures. But it wasn't just items, there were powers too. The power of Thor's lightning, the flame of reflection, and even Ares' destructive power. In front of all this, Proto was even more shocked. If he could buy any of these, he'd basically be a god in human form. But alas, it was just a fantasy every man has. And of course, reality hit hard. He couldn't afford any of it because, let's face it, he was poor. And now, Proto's life was about to change. But as mentioned earlier, he was poor in both real life and in his job working for the gods. The cheapest item in the the god's shop cost around 70,000 Thors, and Proda had worked like a dog just to earn 12. But surely there was something affordable, right? And there was talents. It was pretty wild to see that they sold talents, but then again, if they sold the powers of gods, selling talents didn't seem so strange. But what was the price? Surprisingly, it was only 12 Thors, which was absurdly low. After reading the comments on the item, Proda understood why. The gods were already too powerful, so why would they need talents, which were more of a human thing? Still, it was mind-blowing because it was an SS-rank talent. After browsing for a bit, Proda naturally chose the sword talent. After all, it had been his childhood dream to become a swordsman, so it was an obvious choice. And finally, he acquired his first talent since awakening. However, he didn't feel any different. But hey, it was better than nothing, right? For someone who had nothing, getting an SS-rank talent was already a huge deal. But today was Proda's lucky day. The system congratulated him on his first purchase at the God Store, and there happened to be a 1+1 event, meaning he could choose another item of the same rank for free. This almost gave Proda a heart attack. It was like he had hit the jackpot. The second talent he chose to complement his sword talent was the combat talent. Now, Proda had not one, but 2 SS-rank talents. However, at that moment, something strange started to happen. The world around him began to blur, and Proda felt himself fading. So much was happening on the same day that he couldn't make sense of it all. His body was sore. Was it because of all the work? Then the system informed him that his body was being strengthened to handle the new talents. After all, he had a lowly F-rank body, and his lung capacity, muscle strength, and other physical traits were being enhanced to match his new abilities. The pain was so intense that it triggered an old memory of his mother, where she was apologizing to him for being an incompetent mother and causing him to suffer. Proda tried to yell out to her, saying she didn't need to worry anymore because he now had a talent, but his voice didn't reach her. After all, it was just a memory. After what felt like an eternity, Proda finally woke up, lying on the floor, feeling like he had a hangover. He wondered if everything that had just happened was a dream, but he quickly opened the system and saw that it was real. All his talents were there. Life is funny, isn't it? A man with no talent like Proda had become something like a god. Life truly is full of surprises. Speaking of dreams, at that moment Proda's mother called him. His phone was practically falling apart, but he took the opportunity to tell her the good news, that he had finally acquired a talent. But he didn't even get the chance to say much. She quickly told him not to come to the hospital, which worried him. He asked if something had happened, but she said no and reassured him that there was no need to come. Then, someone else suddenly took the phone from his mother and asked if Proda was her guardian. The voice on the other end explained that the situation was delicate and they couldn't give too many details, but they could inform him that signs of a dungeon were detected near the hospital. Because of this, no visitors were allowed until the situation improved. At that moment, Proda wasn't even listening anymore. He was running, calling out for his mother in his mind. Was all his newfound luck coming at a cost? As Proda reached the hospital, it felt like the end of the world. There were helicopters in the sky, people running in the streets, and news of an impending disaster on TV. Proda finally arrived at the hospital, only to find a massive crowd. He wondered what on earth was going on. Suddenly, his combat focus ability kicked in, and he began hearing a man on top of a bus shouting that everyone needed to leave the area because it was restricted. But it wasn't just his voice. Proda could hear the conversations of the officers and the people around him all at once. The overwhelming noise in his head made him feel like he was going insane. Where had this ability come from? Was it part of his talent? But that didn't matter right now. He pushed through the crowd, shouting that his only family was inside the hospital. However, the officers wouldn't let him pass, explaining that there were signs a labyrinth was about to appear. The mention of a labyrinth caught Proda's attention. Just then, a deafening rumble echoed through the air, and once again, a lightning bolt struck from the sky. Proda really must be a lightning magnet. It just keeps happening. It's already the third lightning bolt in just 3 chapters. After all that chaos, Proda got up, questioning what on earth had just happened. Then, looking ahead, he saw the portal to the labyrinth. And to top it off, that dungeon? It was the very one he had helped build. Seriously, what are the odds of that? Either he has insane luck, or the worst luck imaginable, right? I mean, what's the probability of landing right where his own creation popped up? I'm starting to think Proda is more like the god of bad luck than anything else. Proda was completely bewildered. Everything was happening so fast, going from 0 to 100 in no time. But snapping back to reality, he noticed that there were a lot of injured people around him. The man he was helping told him they needed to evacuate immediately. Suddenly, Proda felt something and instinctively pushed the old man aside. Just then, something flew between them, a sword or maybe a machete. Looking to the side, Proda saw a man with a knife in his chest, screaming for him to run. Who had stabbed the man? That's right, those lizard men he had helped create with the ogre earlier. And it wasn't just one lizard man, there were a lot of them. The military was there, shooting at the lizard men, but it had no effect. To make things worse, Proto was right in the middle of the crossfire. A lizard man, wielding another blade, charged straight at Proto. But as the creature rushed toward him, Proto's combat-focused skill activated again. An aura seemed to surround him, and everything around him slowed down. He could see every detail of the battlefield, as if time had frozen. Without even thinking, he grabbed the machete aimed at him. He was stunned. How had he managed to catch it? He didn't understand what was happening, and it scared him, but there wasn't time to process it. As the first threat was neutralized, a second one emerged. Would the man be hit by the knife? Could Proto save him? Would the soldier shoot the lizard man? Or would the lizard man kill everyone? None of that happened. Instead, Proto leaped toward the lizard man. Seeing this, the military stopped firing and started wondering if Proto was a hunter. If he was probably crazy, because he had just rushed into a camp full of enemies, completely unarmed. Proto, trembling with fear, somehow managed to dodge the lizard man's attacks again, thanks to his ability activating once more. Was his superior instinct kicking in without him even realizing it? Before he could catch his breath, another lizard man attacked, one from the front and another from behind. But Proto easily dodged their strikes. It was almost like he had chugged a gallon of coffee. His reflexes were sharp, and everything seemed to be moving in slow motion for him. With that clarity, he could finally counterattack. His combat talent activated, and Proto hit all of the lizard man's weak points, sending him flying. Looks like that talent he bought wasn't from the bargain bin after all. But two lizard men remained. Proto's superior skill kicked in once again. Channeling his inner Brazilian with a Korean body, he delivered a capoeira kick that shattered the lizard man's jaw. The remaining lizard man charged at Proto from behind. Why do they always attack from behind? This one wanted to up the ante, slashing his blade along the ground for a dramatic attack. But Proto wasn't having it. Channeling his Olympic-level gymnastics, or maybe acrobatics, he performed a stunning leap into the air, avoiding the attack. The shoes he was wearing weren't Adidas. They were Abiba's knockoffs, but at least they got the job done. The soldiers watching from a distance were amazed, even wondering aloud what brand his shoes were. But Proto wasn't just showing off for fun. He was giving a masterclass in capoeira, acrobatics, and pure survival instinct. Out of nowhere, an old man approached, asking if Proto was part of a guild. His skills were just that impressive. The old man, with a scar on his face, introduced himself as Nangun Dyukai, the master of the Sangan Guild. But since that name's a bit of a mouthful, let's just call him Nagan. Nangun asked Proto if he was a freelance hunter. Still confused, Proto answered that he thought so. But time was short, so Nagan invited Proto to join them in clearing the dungeon. Proto was shocked. He still hadn't fully grasped the fact that he wasn't just a normal person anymore. He had finally become what he always dreamed of being. Realizing that if they didn't clear the dungeon, more monsters would spill out and endanger his mother, Proto knew he had to go in. He was familiar with the dungeon structure, having helped build it, so it made sense for him to lead the way. Luckily, he had memorized the layout after all those trips in and out while working on it. The challenge now was whether the others would believe him. But hey, it was worth a shot, right? So Proto asked Nagan if he could lead the way from there. Of course, one guy in the group didn't like that idea. He wasn't about to take orders from a rookie freelancer who wasn't even in a guild. To prove his point, Proto mentioned the traps ahead. But Nagan reassured him that they didn't need to worry. Their advanced team had likely already cleared the way ahead. In response, Proto didn't say a word. He simply picked up a small pebble and tossed it forward. As soon as it hit the ground, a trap was triggered and blades came out, spinning like crazy. Wait, spinning blades from a pebble? Is that even a thing? Wow, I think I'm losing it a bit here. But at least it proved one thing. The advanced group definitely hadn't cleared the traps. Proto then had to explain step by step that the trap was triggered by decompression. The blades were so sharp that even the strongest armor would be pierced like styrofoam. However, despite his white hair, Nagan was pretty smart and questioned the protagonist about how he knew all that stuff. Of course, the protagonist couldn't just say he helped build that dungeon, so he threw out the classic, it's just a trade secret. With that, they kept moving further into the dungeon, with the protagonist obviously leading the way. At one point, the protagonist grabbed a torch from the wall and mentioned that things were about to get a lot more dangerous from here on out. They found themselves in a dark area, and right ahead of them was a symbol that didn't look very inviting. At that moment, things were were about to get real messy, and when I said it was going to get crazy, I wasn't kidding. And that's where we'll wrap it up for today, folks. If you want more of the story, let me know in the comments. Let's see. Comment something random, like, come on, Thor, hit me with another lightning bolt. You know, that meme vibe? Because hey, Prota's been struck by lightning 3 times already, so yeah, comment, come on, Thor, if you want a part 2. Alright, I'm rambling too much. Go check out the next video because it's even better.